The noose swayed gently in the desert wind, casting a serpentine shadow across the wooden platform. Sarah Mitchell stood on the gallows with her hands bound, her dark hair whipping around her pale face as she stared out at the gathered crowd. The territorial judge had been swift and merciless, 3 days from arrest to conviction to this moment, standing above the dusty street of Redemption, New Mexico, waiting to die. She hadn't killed anyone. That was the bitter irony twisting in her gut as Sheriff Tom Bradshaw read the charges one final time. Accessory to murder, they called it. Her husband had shot a man during a card game, claimed self-defense, but the dead man's brother was a territorial senator. Justice, Sarah had learned, wasn't blind, it just looked the other way when powerful men demanded vengeance. Her husband had fled that same night, disappearing into the Badlands with whatever money he could grab. He'd left her sleeping, taken both horses, and by dawn he was nothing but dust on the horizon. When the sheriff came, Sarah had nothing to offer but the truth, and the truth hadn't been enough. The judge wanted someone to hang, and she was all that remained. The crowd was smaller than she'd expected. A hanging usually drew folks from miles around, but a woman on the gallows made people uncomfortable. They shuffled and whispered, some looking away, others watching with the morbid fascination of those who'd come too far to turn back now. Sarah recognized the blacksmith, the woman who ran the boarding house, several ranch hands she'd seen around town. They were all strangers now, every face a closed door. Sheriff Bradshaw cleared his throat and began to place the hood over her head when a voice cut through the morning air like a rifle shot. "Hold on there, Sheriff." Every head turned toward the source. A man emerged from the crowd, tall and weathered, with the kind of lean strength that came from years of hard work under an unforgiving sun. He wore a dusty black coat over worn denims, and a hat that had seen better days shadowed his face. Sarah didn't recognize him, but something in his steady gait suggested a man who'd faced down worse things than a hanging scaffold. Sheriff Bradshaw lowered the hood, irritation flickering across his features. "This ain't a time for interruptions, Cole. Sentence has been passed." "I know what the sentence is," the man said, stopping at the base of the gallows. His voice carried that quiet authority of someone who didn't need to shout to be heard. "And I know the law. Territorial statute says a life debt can be claimed for capital crimes. Someone can take the condemned's place if they're willing." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Sarah's heart lurched in her chest. She'd heard of such things, old laws left over from the early territorial days, but she'd never known anyone to invoke them. Who in their right mind would trade places with a person condemned to hang? The sheriff's jaw tightened. "That law hasn't been used in 20 years, Cole. You can't seriously." "Is it still on the books?" Cole interrupted, his blue eyes steady on the sheriff's face. "Well, yes, but then I'm claiming it. I'll take her place." Sarah found her voice, cracked and desperate. "No. No, you don't even know me. You can't." Cole finally looked up at her, and something in his gaze made her words catch in her throat. There was no fanaticism there, no wild righteousness. Just a bone-deep weariness, and something else she couldn't quite name. "I know you didn't kill anyone, ma'am. That's enough." The sheriff looked like he'd swallowed something sour. He glanced at his deputy, then at the judge's written order in his hand. The crowd's murmuring grew louder, people pressing closer to hear what would happen next. This was unprecedented, the kind of story folks would tell for years. "The statute requires the condemned to accept the trade," the sheriff said slowly, clearly grasping at any straw that might preserve his orders. "Mrs. Mitchell, do you accept this man's offer?" Sarah stared down at Cole, this stranger who'd just offered to die in her place. Every instinct screamed at her to say no, that she couldn't let an innocent man hang for crimes either of them had committed. But survival was a powerful force, and freedom sang in her blood like a hymn. She thought of her daughter, only 5 years old, staying with her sister in Santa Fe. If Sarah died today, Emily would grow up without either parent, marked by shame and whispers. Her voice broke. "Why would you do this?" Cole's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Pain maybe, or regret. "I got my reasons, ma'am. Do you accept or not?" The sheriff was already looking relieved, probably calculating how this would play out politically. A man choosing death was heroic, not the messy execution of a woman that would haunt the town's reputation. The crowd seemed to lean in as one, waiting for her answer. "Yes," Sarah whispered. "God help me, yes." The next few minutes passed in a blur. The sheriff untied Sarah's hands and helped her down from the gallows, his relief palpable despite his attempts at official solemnity. Cole climbed the steps without hesitation, his movements calm and deliberate. Sarah stood on shaking legs, watching as they bound his hands where hers had been moments before. She should leave. She should run before someone changed their mind, mount a horse and ride until redemption was nothing but bad memory. But her feet wouldn't move. She watched Cole stand where she'd stood, watched him face his death with more grace than she'd managed. Wait. The word tore from her throat before she could stop it. Wait, please. I can't let you do this. I can't let you die for something you didn't do. Cole looked down at her, and for the first time, something like a smile touched his weathered face. Life ain't about what we do, ma'am. Sometimes it's about what we're willing to trade for something that matters more. But why? You don't know me. You don't know me anything. Maybe I'm just tired, he said quietly, but there was more to it than that. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the resignation in his eyes that went deeper than this moment. This was a man who lost something, maybe everything, and saw in this trade not just her salvation but his own release. The sheriff cleared his throat again, clearly eager to proceed before anyone else could interrupt. He'd already pulled the hood from his coat pocket when a rider thundered into the square, his horse lathered with foam and dust. Sheriff! The rider shouted, sliding from his saddle before the animal fully stopped. Sheriff Bradshaw! Message from the territorial governor! Everyone froze. The rider, a young postal courier Sarah recognized from the express office, ran forward with a sealed envelope clutched in his fist. The sheriff snatched it, broke the seal, and read with widening eyes. The silence stretched impossibly long. Sarah felt each heartbeat like a drum in her chest, watching the sheriff's face cycle through surprise, confusion, and finally something that might have been relief or disappointment. She couldn't tell which. It's a stay of execution, Bradshaw finally announced. Pending a new trial. Seems someone came forward with new testimony about what really happened that night. He looked at Sarah with an expression she couldn't quite read. Your husband turned himself into authorities in Arizona territory. Confessed to the killing and said you had no part in it. The words didn't make sense at first. Sarah felt them bounce off her mind like stones off water, unable to sink in. Her husband had confessed? Jack, who'd abandoned her to save himself, had turned himself in. There's more. The sheriff continued, scanning the document. Says here he couldn't live with the thought of you hanging for his crime. Turned himself in on the condition they drop all charges against you. Sarah's legs gave out. She would have fallen if Cole hadn't moved with surprising speed, catching her elbow and steadying her even with his hands still bound. The crowd erupted in noise, some cheering, some grumbling about the spectacle, others already turning away now that the show was over. The sheriff untied Cole's hands with obvious reluctance. Looks like nobody hangs today. This is highly irregular, but the governor's word is law. He fixed Cole with a hard stare. You got lucky, both of you. But it wasn't luck, Sarah thought as the world slowly righted itself around her. It was something stranger and more painful, a husband who'd failed her in every way that mattered, finding just enough courage at the end to do one right thing. It was a stranger willing to die for someone he'd never met because he carried his own unbearable weight. It was a fragile moment where everything could have gone wrong and somehow hadn't. As the crowd dispersed and the sheriff rolled up his papers, Sarah turned to Cole. He stood beside her, looking not relieved but somehow lost, as if he'd been prepared for an ending that wouldn't come now. You were really going to do it? She said. It wasn't a question. Yes, ma'am. Why? Cole was quiet for a long moment, staring at something far beyond the dusty street and false front buildings. Lost my wife and boy to fever 2 years back. Been working my ranch alone since then, and I won't lie to you, some days it don't feel worth the effort. When I heard they were fixing to hang you for something your husband did, something you couldn't have stopped. He paused, then met her eyes. Guess I figured if I was going to check out anyway, might as well mean something. Might as well save someone who deserved better. The rawness in his admission took her breath away. Here was a man so hollowed out by grief he'd been willing to trade his life for meaning, any meaning at all. And she'd been seconds away from letting him. You deserve better too, Sarah said softly. Whatever you've lost, whatever you're carrying, you deserve better than giving up. Cole shook his head slowly. Ain't about deserving, ma'am. It's about what you can live with. They stood together in the thinning crowd, two people who'd faced death that morning and found themselves still breathing. The sun climbed higher, indifferent to human drama, warming the New Mexico earth toward another scorching afternoon. Finally, Sarah spoke. My sister runs a cafe in Santa Fe. I'm heading there to get my daughter. We'll need to start over somewhere new, away from all this. She hesitated, then pressed forward. A cafe can always use someone who knows about hard work. And my daughter could use some kindness in her life after what she's been through. Cole looked at her, surprise breaking through his carefully neutral expression. I'm not asking you to be anything but yourself. Sarah continued. But if you're looking for a reason to keep going, maybe it could be something as simple as showing a little girl that good people still exist. Maybe it could be helping two people who also need to start over. She managed a small smile. And maybe someday you'll find that living means something again. For the first time since he'd stepped out of that crowd, something like hope flickered across Cole's weathered face. It was tentative and fragile, but it was there. I don't know if I'd be much good at. None of us know, Sarah interrupted gently. But we could try. And trying is more than either of us had an hour ago. Cole considered this, his gaze drifting to the empty gallows behind them. The noose still swayed in the breeze, a reminder of what might have been. Then he looked back at Sarah and slowly nodded. Santa Fe, you said? Santa Fe. Reckon I could make it there in a few days if I ride steady. They parted ways then, Sarah to collect what little she had left in redemption, and Cole to gather his affairs at his ranch. But as Sarah walked down that dusty street, feeling the sun on her face and freedom in her limbs, she carried with her the knowledge that sometimes salvation came from unexpected places. Sometimes it came from strangers who needed saving just as much as you did. And sometimes the worst day of your life could become the first day of something better, if you were brave enough to reach for it.